Welcome to GS Podcast number 135. I'm Stephen Knight. How are you? There's no point saying anything, I can't hear you. I'm very pleased to bring you a conversation with Lloyd Evans. Fascinating chat. Lloyd's an ex-Jehovah's Witness, now an atheist. More on Lloyd in a moment. A couple of things I'd like to point you in the direction of. There's a brand new Taking the Myth topical discussion podcast out. Me and Iram go through all the major headlines and happenings over the last few weeks, and that's great fun, and I'm really pleased about all the feedback you've been sending about that, so thank you. If you haven't listened to it, check it out. I've also produced a little bit of video content these last few weeks. I was at the Protest the BBC event organised by Tommy Robinson. Mixed bag, that, I'll be honest, but I documented the general atmosphere. I also spoke to people on both sides of the divide there. I spoke to the counter-protesters, I spoke to the protesters, got some interviews. But go to youtube.com/gspellchecker, check out them videos, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. Lastly, I returned to Ricky Gervais's Deadly Serious podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I think that was just released this week for those in the States. For those in the UK, I think it'll probably land sometime on YouTube in the next 7 days or so. For those of you who don't live in a real country, I'm sure it'll be released on Audible at some point as well, so check that out, that's great fun. And it's really quite refreshing and unique to have someone of Ricky's stature to dedicate 90 minutes of his platform to talk about wokeness and culture and politics and religion and free speech, you know, all the things that I'm massively interested in and that I think are incredibly important, but don't get discussed enough. So that was great fun. I really enjoyed doing that, so I'll make sure to point you towards it as soon as that becomes available. Alright, so you'll be hearing my conversation with Lloyd Evans shortly. Lloyd's an ex-Jehovah's Witness, he's a writer and filmmaker, and he's the author of The Reluctant Apostate. Always excited to talk to an apostate from a very conservative religious group. I mean, I can understand why a lot of people would leave these groups, but I often feel that they'd probably just prefer a quiet life and, you know, to just disappear into obscurity. But I have a tremendous amount of respect for the people who go the other way and say, not only am I going to emancipate myself from this horrible situation, but I'm going to make some noise about it, I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to write about it. And that's what Lloyd does, and I can only imagine that might make things a little easier for other people to come out of the church and have someone they can use as an example of how it's possible, essentially. So we'll be getting right into his very strict Jehovah's Witness upbringing, the ramifications that's had for him personally, including his family, which is, you know, quite sad. But he's a nice guy, and he's a bright guy, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot, as did I. Jehovah's Witness is not a cult, is that fair? Yeah, I think we'll say cult. It's not a religion I'm particularly well versed in, so it was great to hear from somebody who knows their stuff about it. So if you've enjoyed hearing from Lloyd, which I'm sure you will, make sure you send him some love, some feedback, some kind words. I'll put his Twitter address in the show notes of this episode, but you can find it at Cedars JW Survey, so that's Cedars CEDARS JW Survey. Send him some love. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com, and you can support me in so many ways, it's unbelievable. You can find out more information about that at gspellchecker.com/support. Enjoy. There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell, ain't it? Horrible, except after saying, who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took across the God of creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means, and he said, and go A-C-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-C-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we don't speak the double E. And then he keeps turning out these godless say, a reason sharp as a knife will make him run away, but if they stop that fight, well, they can go all day. Spell checker, easy, gotta spell check, and now you know how it goes, so sing along with me. A-C-H-E-I-S-T, 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 A-C-H-E-I-S-T. I'm very pleased to welcome Lloyd Evans to the GS podcast. Lloyd, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. This being a Sunday, I'm nice and relaxed.
Yeah, no church today, no church.
No, exactly, no Kingdom Hall to go to. So these are the benefits of being an apostate.
Yes, amen, brother, amen. So maybe you can just give my listeners a brief overview of what it is you do. How would you describe how you spend your time nowadays?
I'm now an ex-Jehovah's Witness activist. I never thought I would say that because obviously I grew up in the religion, took it very, very seriously indeed. I even was an elder at one point. And I also spent a lot of time knocking on people's doors, trying to persuade them to join my religion. But I came to the realization that it wasn't true and went through a very difficult process of realigning my life to account for that, and ended up getting involved in activism. I founded a website called jwsurvey.org, which is a resource for people who are having doubts about the witness faith. I wrote a book called The Reluctant Apostate. I also have a YouTube channel under the pseudonym I was using, John Cedars, which I used when I was still technically a witness and at risk of being shunned. So that's roughly what I'm involved in now.
Excellent. Well, that is interesting. There's a lot there that I'll probably circle back round to a bit later on in the conversation, but maybe you could, it might be helpful just to give my listeners, as brief as you can, an overview of the distinction between a sort of mainstream Church of England Christianity and the denomination of Jehovah's Witness. Where does it where does it branch off? What are the distinct differences?
I would guess that most Anglicans don't think that any moment now the world is going to end in Armageddon and only their religion will be worthy of survival into the new world. I think the doomsday element very much sets witnesses apart. They are millenarian, if that's a correct word. They believe in Christ's literal 1,000-year reign, which will begin at Armageddon and will proceed through 1,000 years of paradise. And this paradise will be landscaped over the remains of 7.5 billion people who will be slaughtered at Armageddon for the crime of not being Jehovah's Witnesses.
Sounds reasonable.
That's the part of their pitch that you don't really hear. You just hear the kind of universally appealing, wouldn't you like to live in a paradise where you're frolicking with pandas and eating watermelons? That's the main thrust of their pitch, but they don't really tell you what happens to you if you turn down their offer.
Yeah, and I suppose that you would have, obviously you've heard this a million times, I'm sure this has been brought up a million times, should I say, but one of the things that comes to mind immediately when someone says Jehovah's Witnesses, I mean, it invokes memories of my childhood of hiding behind the furniture whilst they knocked on my door. And so they're very evangelical in their...
So that's where everyone was. Yeah. Now we know. I can set that to rest. Yeah.
So they're very evangelical in ethos, really, which does kind of set them apart from various other strains of Christianity, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it's because they take it so seriously. They really do think that this is going to happen any moment now. They believe that we are in the last days of the last days, which began in 1914, and Armageddon is going to arrive at any moment. And in their minds, since this is definitely going to happen, the responsible thing to do is to warn as many people as possible. So that's why they engage in knocking on doors. And more recently, they've started with cart witnessing, where they'll, most people will now be familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses standing next to carts with colourful literature in city centres. That's more of a recent development. But what's interesting is I've done this work. I was a regular pioneer for 9 years, and regular pioneers, just to let your listeners know, they pledge to do 70 hours per month for free of preaching. And in 9 years of doing it, and I wouldn't say I was that bad at it, but I never succeeded in persuading a single person from the doorstep to become a Jehovah's Witness. And I always wondered, why is it that people aren't taking me up on this offer that's so wonderful? And only when you wake up and you get out do you realize, it's because they've all got Google. And because the minute if they really take it seriously and they're really interested, I mean, who wouldn't want to see what the other side of the argument is? And it literally just takes a few seconds of clicking around to see the more uglier side of the religion. So now I know why I was so unsuccessful.
So, I mean, you really believe this then? I mean, I don't want to assume, but I would imagine this is something that you were born into, really, something, a product of your family's beliefs, that you came into this way of believing. Obviously, you can clear that up if I'm wrong, but so you wasn't just doing this as routine, as this is normal, this is something we do, and didn't really question it. You genuinely believe that you were in the act of saving souls?
I think you go through a transition as a child. It's made very clear to you. And I think this is one of the things I'd really like to get across to your listeners, because I think that there's this misconception that people who are in cults are in cults because they're stupid.
Yeah.
Because they are just basically gullible and will swallow anything that they're told by their leaders. But what you have to remember is that when you are raised in a group that is telling you, listen, there's this whole narrative that Satan's world is telling you that's wrong. Evolution is wrong. The governments are led by Satan. We have God's one and only truth, and Armageddon is coming any moment. And the way to survive Armageddon is to listen to these men in America. When you're told that from a very early age, you just believe it because, for evolutionary reasons, we're programmed, or children are programmed to just do what their parents tell them to do and obey their parents and believe what their parents are telling them. So I definitely took it seriously. And as witness children, what you then have is a situation where you're going to school looking at all of your classmates thinking, all of you deserve to die if Armageddon comes tomorrow, unless you become Jehovah's Witnesses. And so you're actually tasked as a Jehovah's Witness going to school with, if possible, converting your classmates and converting your teacher. You're told this is your territory. The congregation can't get into your school, but you can. So you're not just going to school to learn, you're also going to school to teach, which means that if the subject of evolution comes up, you should really think about standing up and telling your teacher that you know better. That's
surely an uncomfortable moment were that to happen. So, you touched on the point earlier that you was an elder. You were an elder, should I say? And how does one? I mean, what is an elder, and how does one attain that status?
Well, it helps if you have a penis.
Okay.
This is a very male-centric organization where, if you're a woman, there's very, very little that you can do. You can make comments during the meetings if you're a woman. You can give demonstrations of how to offer literature on the platform. You can clean the Kingdom Hall, and you can regular pioneer. And that's pretty much it if you're a woman. If you're a man, there are more opportunities open to you. You can become a ministerial servant, which is the first step towards becoming an elder. And then if you get the tap on the shoulder and they say, we'd like to appoint you as an elder, that gives you added responsibility in not just giving talks, but also shepherding the congregation, so providing pastoral care. But you also have the responsibility of dealing with wrongdoing, which takes us into a whole other area of covering up child sex abuse, because the witnesses have their own kind of law code, which says you need to have 2 witnesses or something like sex abuse didn't happen. And so that's why witnesses are in so much trouble at the moment, because they have this whole elaborate judicial system set up, administered by elders under the guidance of the organization and its governing body, that are telling them, look, if this 2 witness requirement isn't satisfied, it didn't happen, and you're not to report it to authorities.
That's a very scary thought, isn't it? And obviously the parallels you can draw there between the Catholic Church and Mormonism and various other stripes. So how many years of your life were spent entrenched in this denomination of Christianity then? At what age did you start questioning?
So again, I was raised in it. I got baptized fairly early at the age of 11, although there are actual examples in Watchtower literature of people being baptized as witnesses as young as 7. The key thing with baptism is that once you are baptized, there's no turning back. There's no graceful exits out of the organization. If you decide you want to leave for conscientious reasons, once you are baptized, you're past the point of no return. You will be shunned by your whole family if you decide to leave, or if you're thrown out for transgressing the rules. And so I got baptized at 11, and I guess I first started to have doubts at the age of sort of 19, 20. There was a new book that was released on Bible prophecy, and amazingly, I found myself not agreeing with some of these rather fanciful interpretations of Daniel's prophecy that were ascribed to early Watchtower history. And wouldn't you know, this obscure text in Daniel was talking about this event in Watchtower history and that kind of thing. I found myself disagreeing with it. But I was able to put those doubts to one side because my mother died when I was 21. And I was so determined to see her again in the future resurrection, because as a witness, you're told, well, they're not really dead. They're still alive in Jehovah's memory. They're going to be resurrected into the paradise earth. So if you want to see them again, you've got to stay faithful and you've got to make it through Armageddon. So I put all of those doubts to one side. And it wasn't until I was 29, 30, and through a long kind of complicated set of circumstances, I'd married a Croatian Jehovah's Witness, and we'd moved to Croatia. And that simple act of moving to another country where I couldn't understand the language and couldn't understand what was being said at the meetings prompted me to kind of look inwardly and think, what do I really believe? And that's when I realized that I really didn't genuinely believe the religion.
Wow. So I suppose whenever I speak to an apostate of any faith, really, one of the running themes is the rift it causes between friends and family. And you've mentioned there as well, you married to somebody who's also a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah.
And I hope you don't mind me asking, are you still married?
Well, yes, I am, but the same cannot be said of everyone in that situation. And it really is a traumatic experience to go through. I mean, first of all, you've got this whole existential crisis. I mean, who am I? I mean, everything I've been told about the world and about science and about politics is all complete nonsense. I now have to figure out what I believe and figure out what's true and what's not true. And as if all of that weren't enough, if you're in a relationship, if you're married to someone who's still very much in, you're then thinking, am I going to end up getting divorced? And imagine how complicated things are if you have children. I mean, we didn't have children, but we wanted to have children. So then I'm thinking, well, if we're able to overcome this hurdle, what do we then do if we have a child? Do we raise it as a Jehovah's Witness? Do I put my foot down and say, no way? What happens then? So there was so many issues kind of that I was wrestling with. I didn't get diagnosed at the time, but I think I must have had something close to a nervous breakdown. I just remember being utterly, utterly depressed, not leaving my room for several days, drinking a lot. And it was hard. But once I overcame that, I mean, thankfully in my particular situation, I'd been very lucky in marrying a woman who doesn't appreciate being lied to anyway, doesn't like being played for a fool, and it didn't take too long for her to follow suit.
Right.
But I do know that there are lots of situations where people who are married wake up and it causes them all sorts of hell, especially if there are children involved.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking to an ex-Hasidic Jew on the podcast not so long ago, and he had a very similar tale of friends and family, and I sort of raised the point that religion was sort of notorious for creating these divides in the sense that people can just draw a line between friends and family. But I think he touched on a better point, was that it can be dogma and faith-based thinking in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious, but he's seen parallels with people disowning family members because of political views and things like that. And I suppose my question is, are you still in contact with your family? Are you on good terms? Is there a line of dialogue open between you?
No. And I would just add to what his observations, which I'm sure he made some good points. I think that we all have the right to shun people. I mean, just because you're, born in a particular family doesn't mean you're going to get on. There's all sorts of reasons why you might not want a close relationship with your close flesh and blood.
Yeah.
But the point is, it should be your decision. As long as it's your decision, you can decide who you speak to and who you don't speak to. But in groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and in Hasidic Judaism and other groups as well, they make that decision for you, and they actually, in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, produce highly polished propaganda videos just explaining in very clear terms to parents of, say, a disfellowshipped child, look, imagine them calling you on the phone. Imagine you see their name pop up on your phone. You're not to answer the phone. Now, that child could be in all sorts of peril at that particular moment. Their life could be in danger. No, you're not to pick up the phone. That's the extent of the shunning with Jehovah's Witnesses. And so it puts parents in a situation where they just don't have any choice. I'm sorry, even if it's eating away at them inside, they just have to go along with it. So in my own case, obviously my mother died when I was 21, so she's out of the picture, but my father's still alive. He's an elder. And he hasn't met my 4-year-old daughter yet. He even had an opportunity when I was in the UK, because I was raised, I know you're from Manchester, I actually grew up in Wilmslow.
Oh.
And I was passing through Wilmslow a couple of years back and passed his house, and his hedges were overgrown, and clearly no one was helping him in the congregation. So I actually dropped a card through the letterbox to say, I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'm going to cut your hedges for you. Make sure I've got access to the tools in the shed, and I'm going to come and do that. And I spent the night thinking, is he going to tell me, no, you're not to come, no, you're not to come? And I didn't get any message from him. So I turned up the next day, and he wasn't there. The house had been abandoned. He'd left access to the tool shed, and he'd given us a way to get into the house and make a cup of coffee. So I set about cutting the hedges, and, Jessica, my little daughter, is playing in the garden where I grew up. This is my family home, and her granddad isn't there. And my wife just said, I think I saw your dad drive past. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was him. So I said, oh, okay. And so then I was looking out, and sure enough, he came past again. And it turned out he was circling the house because he was waiting for us to leave so that he could come back. So he had his granddaughter literally meters away, and he couldn't stop the car, get out, and meet his granddaughter. That's the hold that the shunning command has on people.
That's tragic, isn't it? And like you say, people can make the assumption that things like that are motivated by malice, and he will genuinely believe he's doing the right thing. I think he may even think that his actions are informed by a sort of empathy in a way.
Well, he told me when I was telling him that we were going to be leaving, because I was able to give him advance warning. Look, Diana and I have talked about this. We're having a child. We want to make sure our child isn't raised in a religion, and we're going to make a clean break. And he said, well, it'll kill me, Lloyd, but I'm going to have to shun you. And I think it is killing him. I think that it's just such an unnatural thing to go through. But in his mind, his loyalty is first and foremost to the organization. And the way I describe it for people in that situation is they're not in full control of their minds. If you were to meet him, you'd think, well, here's a perfectly, normal, level-headed guy. He seems in full control of his faculties. But in the most basic kind of decision-making aspects, it's the dogma and ideology and dictates of an organization across the Atlantic that are informing his decisions.
So talking of the organization in general, in the UK specifically, do you happen to know how many members it has?
Well, worldwide it's 8.5 million. I think in the UK it's something like 170,000. And
you identify as an atheist now, so it's not that you've... because I'm always very surprised when somebody goes from a very strict religious upbringing to atheism, not in the sense that they, let go of their faith. I'm always surprised that they don't hitch their wagon to another one straight away. But you seem to have taken an alternate route where you reject the idea of a divine being in totality now. And I was just wondering what helped nudge you to that realization.
Just having the freedom to think for myself. I mean,
I'll do it.
It doesn't have to be like that. I mean, I know lots of ex-witnesses who just find another form of religion that suits them. And I happen to be of the opinion that Some people, for whatever reason, seem to need religion in their lives. I don't expect everybody who leaves Jehovah's Witnesses to abandon religion altogether, as I have. However, and I did try briefly to kind of hold a candle for Christianity, and I briefly bought into this idea that I could just be a Christian without affiliating myself to any kind of organization. But then you go on YouTube and you see Christopher Hitchens and it just torpedoes. You think, well, how can I disagree with what he's saying? It just makes just total sense. And, and you think, well, why shouldn't I apply? I've applied all this critical thinking to Watchtower, to the publications I've grown up with. Why shouldn't I apply it to the Bible itself? And when you do apply it to the Bible and you see all the inconsistencies, you see what scholars have to say about it just basically being cobbled together, prophecies written after the fact, unknown authorship, all that kind of thing. You just think, why on earth should I let my life be ruled by that? And then you take a broader view and see how much damage is being wrought by other religions, such as Islam and what have you. And you think, no, I want nothing to do with that. Yeah,
no, I agree. It's very well put. I suppose one of the useful things about the Jehovah's Witnesses is that they are not open to dialogue, should I say, but available, shall we say. So they'll be on the street corners pamphleteering, as you mentioned before. And I was wondering, what advice may you give to somebody who takes it upon themselves to open some dialogue with them? What sort of things do you think could make a difference in discussion with them? Or are we just to accept that they're completely closed off if they're in that position?
Be as non-confrontational and kind and loving as you can possibly be. If you sneer at them, if you laugh at them, if you look down at them, they will interpret this as persecution and further evidence that they are God's one and only true people, because Jesus said, my followers, you'll know my true followers because they'll be persecuted like I was. So they interpret any form of confrontation as persecution. But if you can instead show some humanity, show some kindness and compassion, I actually would encourage people who are genuinely interested in engaging with witnesses, because it is possible, to look into the work of Anthony Magnabosco and study a bit of street epistemology, because that's just an excellent process of dialogue that it's not interested in arriving at a conclusion. It's not interested in achieving a victory. I'm right and you're wrong. It's just a process of asking questions and helping two different sides to understand each other. And you just never know what seed you're going to plant by doing that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because the sort of Socratic method of street epistemology is quite effective at moving people to a more reasonable place, and I suppose that's what you want, really. But it's just very tempting as a non-believer, being armed with all your science and facts, not just to start tossing out truth bombs left, right and centre for the
and infuriating as well, because I actually filmed a video. I'm still in the process of editing it, but I filmed a video where I spoke to some witnesses who were cart witnessing in London. They were, I'm not kidding, they were positioned right outside the Natural History Museum. If you go to the Natural History Museum, I'm not kidding, you're probably going to see some there, and they'll have their literature racks there with creationist propaganda material, essentially, that says evolution is a hoax, we know better. Look at this wonderful seahorse and how could it possibly not have been designed, and that kind. And you think that's actually quite antagonistic. They're coming to a place where people are coming to learn about science, and here they are, rather kind of conspicuously saying we know better. So I can understand the frustration, but you have to remember that these people are not in full possession of their minds. In their heads, they're doing everyone a service. And if only everyone knew what they knew, the world would be a better place. So it really is just a case of taking your anger and putting it completely to one side and thinking, what kind of dialogue can I have where they can understand a little bit more where I'm coming from, and I can understand a little bit more where they're coming from, and we can just have a conversation.
Okay, so when you're sort of knee-deep in this ideology and you're part of the community and the organisation, how did they respond to any form of questioning or dissent? I mean, were they open to discussions internally about the veracity of the scripture or any things people may have been struggling with, such as evolution?
Definitely not. And to this day, there's no quarter given. There's no countenancing anything that might be considered critical of the organisation, anything that might be apostate. When it comes to science, when you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're watching Attenborough talk about evolution, you're thinking, he's fallen for that one, has he? You literally think you know better than scientists. And when it comes to any material on the internet that is critical of the organisation, well, this is apostate lies, and they literally say in their literature that apostates are mentally diseased and eating at the table of demons. And so you're genuinely terrified as a witness at the very thought of going on, for example, my YouTube channel or an apostate website. You're thinking, you're half expecting, a lightning bolt to come down out of the sky and render you a smoldering heap of ash. I mean, these are the very tangible feelings of fear and dread associated with, just honestly scrutinizing your beliefs. And it all comes from the material that you're kind of served regularly at meetings and in the literature.
So you spoke earlier about operating under a pseudonym online and producing content while you still had one foot in that world, or still a member of it. And I was just wondering how you managed to walk that line and keep it a secret. I imagine that's quite a delicate balancing act.
It is difficult, and I think the longer you do it, the harder it gets. I actually have a colleague, Covert Fade. He's a huge fan of your podcast, by the way.
One fan, and amazing.
He's been doing this for years. He's the editor of the website I set up, JW Survey. Nobody knows who he is. He's quite brave in going on my show on the YouTube channel with his voice. But it's incredibly difficult to maintain that for a long period of time. And in my own case, I just reached a point where I was ready for a long time to just come out with my face and with my voice. But I kind of had to factor in my wife's feelings as well, because we're in quite a delicate situation where we're living in the same building as her parents, who are believing Jehovah's Witnesses. And so we're still in a strange way, even though I'm a very outspoken apostate activist, we're still in a very strange way wedded to our witness roots. And it's been a very, very difficult, problematic balancing act, but somehow I think just by showing a bit of patience and just by showing kindness wherever we can, we've managed to negotiate it.
Yeah, as if having in-laws can't be stressful enough. You've added a few extra levels there, haven't you?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, it was touched on earlier about there's an issue of sexual abuse within the church, within the organisation, and I was just wondering how far does that go? What are the specifics exactly? Okay,
so there was a royal commission conducted in Australia in 2015, and they investigated Jehovah's Witnesses as one of their case studies. And as part of their investigations, they managed to get the records from the Australia branch of all of the sex abuse cases. And this was unheard of, because we know that Watchtower keeps these records on databases in each of their branches, but they're very, very secretive, and they don't pass on these records to law enforcement. So when we heard that the Australian authorities had just managed to get them, it was like, wow, okay, now this is getting interesting. And they found that out of 1,006 cases of pedophiles in the organisation, there had been accrued 1,800 victims, and not a single one of these cases had been reported to the authorities, and this is going back to 1950. And I've taken those figures and extrapolated that you'd be looking at somewhere in the region of 20,000 perpetrators worldwide. Actually, not worldwide, just in a certain number of countries that I have records for, publisher records for. We're talking about a dizzying industrial scale level of abuse cover-up, and it's only now that authorities are starting to wise up to it. Like, for example, in the Netherlands, the authorities there recently raided the local headquarters, and we don't know what information they carried away. It's all kind of rather hush-hush, but there's information there. And in the United States, Watchtower recently lost a $35 million lawsuit in Montana, again for covering up abuse. So we're still kind of scratching the surface, but there's evidence that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that there is an enormous amount of abuse being covered up.
So what's playing into this, in your opinion, this desire to cover up? Is it primarily a concern with protecting the organisation, protecting the reputation, or do they tend to feel that issues of this sort are best resolved in-house? Do they somehow feel that their system of belief is superior to the law?
I think it's a little bit the same situation as with the blood transfusions. I mean, if you're an organization that tells people, listen, it's better to die than accept a blood transfusion. Okay, you can say that, but once the first person's died, you've then got blood on your hands, which will become very obvious if you then do a U-turn and say, actually, I've changed my mind. That's when things really start getting serious. So you basically, once you've committed yourself to doing it, you can't change your mind, or you'll be seen as A, weak, and B, culpable. And I think it's something similar with the child sex abuse situation. Once you've started accruing victims, once the number of victims gets into the dozens, hundreds, thousands, you're then past the point of no return, and you can't kind of back down without admitting culpability. And with culpability, of course, comes huge financial cost, because these people need to be paid. So I think it's partly that. It's partly just the culture of secrecy, of privacy, of assuming that this is a sin that should be forgiven. All of these things kind of factor in to the kind of culture of abuse cover-up. Because the thing to remember is that witnesses, if you speak to a witness about child sex abuse, they'll say, well, it's horrific, it's abhorrent. We would distance ourselves as much as possible from any form of sexual impropriety, let alone raping children. But what they don't realize is that the actual documented guidelines that are passed down to elders from the governing body serve to cover up this abuse and create an environment where pedophiles can flourish. So you'll have to ask the leaders why they're still sticking to their guns on this, but sticking to their guns, they are. I mean, it was November 2017, they released a video saying that they will never back down on the two-witness rule. So they're really digging their heels in.
Yeah, it's a tragic state of affairs, isn't it? And it seems to be like children suffer the most from the appalling beliefs of adults. Yeah. So I mean, how does the organisation generate revenue? What's its chief method of gaining funds?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's just about money for Watchtower. I think obviously it has to be to some extent about money, but I think mostly it's about control. It's about controlling as many people as possible. For example, witnesses are against higher education. They dissuade young people from going to college and university. And if your sole aim was to make money, you wouldn't want your followers to be poor and with limited opportunities to provide for themselves. But they're certainly worldwide, but they are still able to take some money in donations, but they have kind of an imbalance, because where they are in countries where they are most able to receive donations because the followers are enjoying a reasonably good standard of living, like America and Britain, the growth is stagnating. It's developing countries, it's countries in South America and parts of Africa that are really driving the growth for Jehovah's Witnesses, where they don't have enough money to contribute. So there's kind of an imbalance there, and we're already seeing the organization starting to downsize, starting to close branches, starting to lay off staff members, which is kind of interesting to see where that will go. But yeah, they are still able to maintain the organization through donations.
So if people wanted to learn a bit more about the faith, you've got your own book that people can get hold of. Where else can people look as well to try and get a bit more information?
So if there's anyone who's made it this far through who's actually a Jehovah's Witness, I'd probably point them to jwfacts.com. It's a wonderful resource that doesn't necessarily dabble in any opinions. It just literally presents the information. It shows quotes directly from the literature and just lets people form their own conclusions. There's also a thriving XJW subreddit where people can find support and a hearing ear. And there's also a website called avoidjw.org where you can find lots of the older publications that you can't get access to anymore. But it turns out that it's in some of the older publications that you learn, the evidence becomes difficult to ignore that this really is a man-made organization that's just making it up as they go along.
So, I suppose you touch briefly on the rejection of blood transfusions. What scriptural defense of refusing that is given? How do we arrive at that idea from the denomination? Okay,
so in the Mosaic law, the Israelites were forbidden from eating blood. There was an exception made to this, actually. If you read in the Bible, there's an example of King Saul's troops in a moment of desperation killing animals and eating the blood. Because they didn't have time, and they were let off the hook, interestingly, because the situation was desperate. And he even says that in the Watchtower publications. But then this prohibition against eating blood is carried through to the New Testament, and I think it's in Acts 15. The Apostle Paul says you're to keep abstaining from blood. And so witnesses say, well, if you're to abstain from eating blood, you certainly wouldn't want to transfuse it. But in saying this, they're obviously ignoring the fact that the Bible writers would have known nothing about the medical application of blood and how it could even conceivably be used to save lives. They're also ignoring a rabbinic principle called pikuach nefesh, which actually is why Orthodox Jews accept blood transfusions. And the principle is that the need to preserve life outweighs the law code. And that's why, for example, you have scriptures where Jesus is telling the Jewish leaders, if your bull falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you're going to, break the Sabbath to get it out. And it's the same principle that Jews are able to use to accept blood transfusions. But because the Jehovah's Witness leadership isn't all that scholarly and just frankly make stuff up on the fly, they just don't think about that side of things, and they're willing to, again, let potentially tens of thousands of witnesses die over this teaching they came up with in 1945.
Okay, Lloyd, well, I pretty much breezed through my questions, so I want to thank you for coming on and expanding my understanding and sharing your experience. Is there anything at all that you'd like to get across that I've not picked up on or not spoke about, or anything you'd like to direct people in the direction of?
Just to reiterate that, as tempting as it is to think that these are just stupid, gullible people, they're not. They've been lied to. They've been exploited in many cases from when they were small children. And in any high control group, whether it's Jehovah's Witnesses, whether it's Islam, whether it's Hasidic Judaism, these people need understanding and patience and love. So the more you can show that to them, the more likely it is that they will realize that, the world isn't under the control of Satan after all, and there are good people out there, and maybe there's some value in applying critical thinking.
Yeah, kill them with kindness is a good method. Indeed. I often find. Lloyd, thank you very much. This has been great.
It's been an honour. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?